Yeah, cool. And you can hear me okay? Awesome. So my name is John, and I serve as President, CEO of St. Mary's Press, and also one of the co-authors of this research report, Going, Going, Gone, the Dynamics of Disaffiliation in Young Catholics. My colleague and other co-author is in the back of the room, Dr. Bob McCarty, so give a wave, Bob. So we are delighted this afternoon to be able to share with you these insights that have been emerging for us over the last 3 to 4 years. So even though our research was conducted formally in 2015-16, we continue to collect the stories of young people as an ongoing initiative and work of this project. The study is titled Going, Going, Gone, and it's a perfectly descriptive title because of everything that we discovered in this listening, deep listening to the stories of young people. It is this pattern that emerged over and over, that the process of disaffiliation is in fact just that. It is a process, that it happens over time until finally I am gone. Or as Dr. Josh Packard says in his research, I'm done. Done with church, but not my faith. So I want to ask this question though, as you come in today, to just take a moment and to think about how do you find yourself arriving this afternoon? When you hear this topic, the disaffiliation of young Catholics, what are you feeling in your body? What are you thinking? Anyone come in with hearing that title and have a little bit of maybe hopelessness or despair? So I see some heads. Over the last couple of years, as we've gone around the country and outside the country presenting to thousands of people, it's very common to come into this topic with this sense of hopelessness, like, oh no, we're doomed. It's over, right? But I hope that in the next hour and 15 minutes, as we move through and take a deep look at what is happening in the lives of young people today, an hour and 15 minutes from now, I think some of that hopelessness is going to be turned to see movements of incredible hope in the midst of all of this. And part of my hope derives from people like you. Because over the last 2 years in presenting this and working with Catholic leaders across the US and Australia, thousands of leaders, every single time, my hope and my inspiration has been deepened by coming to know people like you who care deeply about young people, care deeply about their religious longings, care deeply about their desire for connection and community, and have committed your life to that work. So as we begin today, I want to thank you for being here, for caring about these young people and their search for the sacred, the spiritual, the divine impulses in their life. Our research is both quantitative, meaning we do survey work and we ask a question and we get multiple choice answers, et cetera, quantitative, right? Collecting that kind of data. But more significantly, we set out to do research that was qualitative. Or if you're familiar with Brene Brown, who has popularized this, of course, she talks about this as story data, or data with a soul. And this is very important. Our approach of doing qualitative research, of a deep listening to the stories of young people that began to expose the complexity and the texturedness and the layers of disaffiliation. It's not a simple answer. There's no simple answer. So we listen to the stories, and in this time this afternoon, I'm going to invite you to listen to the stories of 3 of the young people. But I want to invite you to posture yourself in a particular way whenever their stories come up this afternoon. To see if you can posture yourself in a place of sacred listening. Their stories are raw. They're unfiltered. We allowed them to speak their story without filtering or editing out what they needed to say. Can we receive their stories with an open heart versus, see, and this is just what we're conditioned to do. We're conditioned to listen like this. I'm listening to your story, and as you're telling me your story, can't see your name tag there, Paul, as Paul's telling me his story, I'm going, well, that's a dumb idea. Well, where did he come up with that idea? Well, oh, I have an experience like that, right? We all know how to listen like that. So to listen with an open heart and just receive their story as sacred. They are revealing to us the longings of their heart. That's the invitation that I invite us to receive their stories today. As researchers, that's the posture we assume in receiving their stories. So I want to introduce you to the story of Lauren.
If the universe was created by God, then pieces of God are going to be in everything on the planet. That kind of naturalism and the connection with Mother Nature is something that I have really adopted into my personal beliefs. Growing up, I would describe my involvement with the Catholic Church as intense in a positive way. I went to Catholic preschool and I went to public school up until high school when I went to a Catholic high school. We went to Mass every Sunday. Nowadays, when I go to church, I go when my whole family's going to church or when my grandparents invite me to church specifically for something. I would self-identify as a spiritual Catholic with postmodernist philosophies. My identities as spiritual and Catholic are 2 separate but complete identities within themselves. And the postmodernism basically means that I think that asking questions and discovering things about the universe and the world that we live in are positive. But at the end of the day, because none of us are going to know the ultimate truth of what this universe looks like, there's no point in discussing who's right and who's wrong as long as we're not hurting each other. What has been most important for me in the Catholic tradition has been definitely the social justice teachings. I find that when I get to contribute back to the world that has given me so many blessings, I feel so connected to God and to all the people around me. I was always really involved in making sure that the LGBTQIA community in my world always felt welcomed and loved by me, especially as a Catholic, so that I could present to them this image of, I'm a Christian and I love you and I don't think that there's anything wrong with you. I just want to be here and support you. To portray myself in a way that says, through my actions, I am showing you the love of Jesus and God and what I've experienced as a Catholic. If we had that attitude of we're all going to experience this wonderful divinity differently and separately while coming together and sharing that with each other, then I think that that kind of space would allow for more people to feel welcome. I would love to see more movement to have women deacons and priests in the church. As much progress as we've made as a Catholic Church, I feel that that is something that is long overdue. And that's something that I personally feel was definitely incredibly difficult when deciding to stay with the Catholic Church and being a woman. Growing up, I kind of assumed that if you were Catholic, you had to follow specific political beliefs. You had to follow specific lifestyle choices. Everybody had kind of the same attitude and beliefs and lifestyles. That is where I felt like I was on the outskirts of this community, because if I didn't see myself fitting into whatever this looked like, then I wouldn't feel comfortable staying there and building a community, because I felt like I had to hide certain parts of myself. Those certain parts of myself that I wanted to hide are parts of myself that I believe come from experiences that God gave me, that I was made exactly as God wanted me to be made.
Lauren is obviously an incredibly articulate young woman, but we found this over and over in the interviews that we've done with young people. They are incredibly thoughtful about this issue. And the beautiful side of that is that they are deeply interested and care about the religious longings in their life. They're simply not interested in something else that we'll see in a moment. So our study was specifically focused on this question of Catholic youth disaffiliation. Specifically, we're interested in talking to young people between the ages of 15 and 25 who once self-identified as Catholic and now no longer self-identify as Catholic. So that is the focus of our study. And this is very important whenever you're looking at a study to know what the scope of that study was and what it wasn't. So what I'm presenting today doesn't represent every young person. It doesn't represent every young Catholic person. It represents those young people who once self-identified as Catholic and made some choice at some point in their life to no longer identify as Catholic. In other words, to walk away from a Catholic identity. So the question really is, why do some young people leave the church? What we're going to see over the course of our work here is that this is not, I can say at the outset, this is not about the church. If this was about something wrong in Catholicism, then the same exact thing that's happening in the Catholic Church wouldn't be happening in Mormonism, which it is, or in Judaism, which it is, or in Islam, a Muslim tradition, which it is, and every single Christian denomination, which it is. So what we see and what got the attention of church leadership and cultural leaders across the US back in 2007 was when Pew came out with their initial research. If you are aware, the US Census Bureau no longer tracks religious identity data, so Pew has filled in the gap. And every 7 years now, Pew is doing a census of the US population to track religious affiliation. In 2007, they came out with their first set of data that showed that 37 million people in the US now identify as having no religious affiliation. That was about 16% of the US population. And all of a sudden, church leaders, religious leaders across the US started going, whoa, what's going on? And whoa, that explains what I'm seeing anecdotally or hearing anecdotally. But then, 7 years later, Pew repeats the research, and in a 7-year period, this is what set off the alarm bells in the US. In the 7-year period, an additional 20 million people in the US unaffiliated or reported having no religious affiliation, making those who say they have no religious affiliation in the US now the single largest religious demographic in the US, 23% of the US population. So Charles Taylor, the philosopher out of Canada, Catholic philosopher, has been tracking the trends of secularization from ancient times forward. And what Taylor points out is that religious disaffiliation is really nothing new in the modern world. And in fact, the trend towards moving away from organized religion has been happening for about 500 years. But the point is that, that it has been happening so imperceptibly that we haven't paid any attention to it. So what this graph does is it helps us see that the reason why those of us in this room are probably here and why church and religious leaders are feeling so much anxiety today is because of what has happened beginning in around mid-1990s. And you see the rate of acceleration. So religious disaffiliation has been happening for about 500 years, but so gradually that we didn't even see it. But around 1993, it took this turn, and it is just accelerating at such a pace that it is making many people's head spins. Does that make sense? So that anxiety that we're feeling isn't because religious disaffiliation is new. It's because it's happening at such an accelerated rate today, and there's lots of reasons for that. This chart shows that disaffiliation is also not a youth issue. So the pink bars on these graphs show by age demographics or generationally, the rates of disaffiliation in each of those generations. What we see is that the young people today, their parents were really the first generation to have a significant percentage of religious unaffiliation rates. What we see sociologically when we look at this as a sociological, from a sociological perspective and look at trends, we flip this graph over and we begin to see the trend line that we predict will continue. What we also see not happening is that life cycle effect. So church leaders used to depend on, oh, well, disaffiliation is just something kids do because, you know, that's the time of life, and you ask questions and you explore, but when they have children, they'll come back. Or when they want to get married, they'll come back. Are there any pastors in the room that want to report the stats on marriages and funerals and baptisms in your church? It's not happening. So sociologically, what we anticipate is that this is a trend line that we will see continue to progress generationally in the US. Very similar, following the same trend lines that we see throughout Western Europe and Australia. We think the US is probably lagging about 15 years behind the experience of Australia in this regard. So I want to take a quick look at some demographics. First of all, disaffiliation is equally a male and female issue. We saw no difference between boys and girls, young men, young women, in rates of disaffiliation. Second is that, surprising to a lot of religious leaders and not happily received by a lot of religious leaders, disaffiliation is most predominant among the non-Hispanic white population, but almost equally among the Hispanic Latino population. So church leaders who you've heard this, say, well, with immigration and with the Hispanic population increasing, we can depend on that for membership. And what we see in our colleague Catherine Angulo at the McGrath Institute in Notre Dame brings this to our attention, that by second and third generation, the rates of disaffiliation are almost equal to the non-Hispanic white population. We do see correlation in rates of disaffiliation between wealth and disaffiliation. As people's wealth increase, there's a higher rate of disaffiliation. And there's also higher rates of disaffiliation correlated to education level. the higher one's education level, the greater likelihood that you disaffiliate from religious institutions or lose belief in God. So sometimes religious leaders want to say, well, disaffiliation is happening among those who aren't active in the church in the first place. And in fact, that's absolutely not true. And our colleague Josh Packard in his research shows that actually rates of disaffiliation in a non-denominational Christian space happen among the most active members of the church. So this slide is just to say that statistically we see very little difference between young people who participate in Mass regularly and those who don't. The disaffiliation rates seem to be just about the same, no statistical difference. So just want to debunk that myth that disaffiliation is only happening among people who aren't active in the first place, and that isn't accurate. We see the similar thing between enrollment in religious education and Catholic school enrollment. Young people enrolled in Catholic schools, their rate of disaffiliation ultimately is almost the same as those who aren't. So here's a quick quiz. The winner of this quiz gets an all-inclusive trip to, I don't know, pick a place, and Paul will pay for it. So at what age, the median age at which young people just report that they no longer identify as being Catholic? Anyone want to throw out a guess? 15, 16, 19, 21, 13, perfect. Somebody read the report. Okay. So the median age is 13, and whenever you do research, you wonder what your surprise is going to be, and this was one of our surprises. We didn't expect to see that as the median number, but it is. And then once we got into the in-depth interviews with the young people, it became very clear as to why 13 makes perfect sense once you hear their stories. So now you look at a chart like this and you go, wait a second, under age 5, how do I know I no longer self-identify? So let me give you just a quick caveat on this slide so you don't get stumped. What we see in the data when we parse this is that under the age of 10, generally what we see is the reason for disaffiliation has something to do with a change in the family situation. Maybe a mixed marriage, maybe a divorce, maybe the parents decide to leave the church and so the kids go with. Maybe it was parents, and this is a true story. The mother was Lutheran, the father was Catholic. They made a deal. We'll raise our child Lutheran till this age and Catholic at that age. You know, there's all kinds of stories. But under 10 years of age, it's usually some family dynamic. But here's the very important piece, that over 10 years of age, the young people we interviewed could tell us exactly their conscious, thoughtful path to coming to that decision on their own. On their own. And that's really interesting. So where do they go? In this slide, it doesn't tally to 100 if there's anybody in the room trying to do the math right now, because we're making a point with our agnostic piece. But where do they go? And what we see among young people who were once Catholic who leave the church, their trends seem to parallel the general population. The largest number of them move to a space where they say, I have no religious identity, no religious affiliation with organized religion at all. And then a number of them move to some other Christian denomination. If you're trying to figure out the difference between the purple, the Christian Protestant and Christian non-Christian Protestant is referring to mainline liturgical traditions. The other is referring to evangelical or home churches. 13% to non-Christian religions. And here, we put the agnostic piece up here on this slide because it's not an affiliation per se, But what we want to see and also debunk, that just pray for your uncle and God will heal him and save him. And in the interview, he looked at us and he said, "My uncle is dead. Where is your God now?" So a young man who encountered a well-intentioned, loving family with really bad theology, but then there was nobody at his side to help him reconcile that wound. And wound after pain, after this is nonsense, accumulates until the one Jenga block is pulled that collapses the whole thing, and I'm done. Does that make sense? It's a beautiful thing to identify when you listen to these stories and you see this pattern play out across every single story that we've gathered, the hundreds of stories that we've now gathered of people who've gone down this path. So that's interesting. But I want to switch to something that is even more important for us to understand as pastoral leaders of young people. And that is, what we've looked at to this point is what young people can tell us and what we can identify in their life experience. But there is something much bigger at play that is driving this acceleration of religious disaffiliation in the US. Over the last year and a half, I've been going around taking out to dinner sociologists of religion to get them to help me to understand this thing called secularization theory and religious identity. And about a year ago, I took out Dr. Jason Singh at Loyola in Maryland. We went out for a lovely 3-hour dinner, and I asked him to explain this, what was going on, what's driving religious disaffiliation in America. And for 3 hours, he explained it to me. And at the end of 3 hours, I looked back at him and I said, "I don't know what you said at all. I have no idea what you just said to me." He said, "John, think of it this way. It's this bigger thing." And he said, "That's a technical term, so you can quote me." The bigger thing. So I want to take a look at this. And we might call this secularization. But I'm cautious in using that word because a lot of times that word gets misinterpreted as meaning that godlessness. And in fact, what we see in America in particular is that secularization is not about the loss of belief in God, but it is about the shifting role and place of authority of religion in culture. And that is this bigger thing that's happening. And it's being driven by all of these forces like globalization, pluralization, rationalization, capitalism, detraditionalization, personal autonomy. All of these things are driving this shift much more than anything that has to do with the church and its teachings and its moral failures. So I want to look at one aspect of this, just one aspect, and that's this. It's the deinstitutionalization of culture. In other words, what we see happening across all of society is the breakdown of trust in institutions, of all institutions. Increasingly, we simply do not trust institutions. We don't trust them to have our best interest in mind, and therefore we're walking away from them. So this is research from our colleague Josh Packard, looking at all kinds of institutions and looking at the trend line of people's trust in these institutions. And in case you can't see the trend line, he gave us a little help. And every single one of them is declining. And when we look closer at, do people trust the leadership of these institutions, we see even a worse scenario, none of them score better than 50%. And leadership that is trusted the least is religious organization leadership. In the Catholic Church, we're fortunate to track data. We track all kinds of data because we're a sacramental church, and we track sacramental records. And so when we look at the markers within the Catholic institution, we see a very similar pattern. This is across the last 17 years of tracking the number of reported incidents in all of this, and we see a similar trend line. Every one of these is on a downward trend line. But Patrick Manning says this, that while fewer and fewer Catholics recognize the relevance of organized religion, engagement, none of this is to say that spirituality and religion is on the way out. So what we see happening in culture is this significant shift. Sociologists would call this an epoch shift. Culture is fundamentally shifting in terms of the place where religious authority is identified in a person's life. So the shift is from where my religious identity is centered in an institutional organized religion to religious identity that is centered in myself, in personal choice, personal autonomy. So what that looks like is that religious identity in society is increasingly shifting away from religious institutions of having authority in people's lives to me constructing my own religious identity out of an amalgam of things, out of an amalgam of social networks and smaller communities. So when Dr. Packard looks at this decline of institutional trust in every single kind of industry you can imagine, and he shows how in that decline of trust, we are reconstructing new kinds of organizations to replace those big institutions. His question is, if that's happening in everything else, if I don't use banks anymore, I just Venmo you for dinner. I had to write my daughter a check the other day, and she didn't know what to do with it. Why do we think organized religion would be any different? And in fact, what's happening is it's no different. That people's trust is moving away from institutional organized religion, and in its absence, they are reconstructing a religious identity around a number of organic, small, local communities.
I grew up very Catholic. My family, I call them super Catholics. It's their life. My dad works for the church. I remember my dad praying with us every evening. He was a very good catechist. Through high school, I was like, I have to follow all the rules. I have to be like a perfect person, a good person. My perspective was very black and white, and I knew the right way, and everybody else didn't who wasn't Catholic. But then when I went to college, things started to change. The people who were in my life weren't all Catholic. I remember feeling uncomfortable because I didn't know how to relate to non-Catholics. I remember asking my roommate one time, like, I noticed that I'm only hanging out and being friends with Catholics, and you are comfortable with everyone. And she said, I just have so much love to give, and it's about loving other people. It's not about whether they're Catholic or not. You start to question everything, and questioning hadn't been a huge part of my upbringing in my Catholic faith. Questioning was allowed as long as you came back to the conclusion that was given to you in the first place. But now I was starting to question and realizing that my conclusions weren't always going back to what I had been given from my youth. That was really scary for me. And during that time, I really lost my faith. I didn't even know if I believed in God anymore. Now, my identification is more Catholic-ish. It's part of my culture. It's how I was raised. And I'm thankful for a lot of it, especially Catholic social teaching. There's such a wealth of beauty and information in Catholic social teaching about how we can better love one another. A huge part of my spirituality is social justice, and I have maybe more liberal leanings in the things that I find trouble with, like being ordained. I think women deserve to follow the call that God has placed in their life as much as anyone else. I'm not interested in a church that divides people. That's what Jesus talked about so much, is unifying people instead of changing people so that they can come to the church. Let people come to the church and then be transformed by their experience.
So Rachel is this wonderful young woman who happened to be one of Bob's students at the Catholic University. So a year after that interview, we were talking with Rachel again, and she said to us, "I no longer identify as being Catholic-ish. I now identify as Catholic adjacent." I mean, you gotta love these young people who just come up with this stuff. But this is what's happening. What you hear there is the fluidity of religious identity. She is in the process of reconstructing a religious identity as she moves away from an identity that was once centrally located in a religious institution. And what we see, disaffiliation looks like this, that gradually I'm moving away until finally this point when I'm saying, this place is no longer the center of my identity. But for Rachel, I still am adjacent to it. I still draw upon its social teachings. I still draw upon parts of it as a cultural experience. But I want to take a quick look at what we see happening in the US, because although young people are walking away from religion, they have a deep longing for and are seeking and constructing new religious communities that are really quite incredible. And so we look at this process, and we'll just use the name Rachel. And as Rachel has deconstructed her identity centered in an organized religious institution, she is reconstructing a religious identity out of an amalgam of communities. For instance, the dinner party. Is anyone here a member of a dinner table? So, if you don't know about this, listen to this story and you tell me what you hear. So the dinner party was started by two young adult women in Los Angeles. Both had experienced some significant loss in their life that was never reconciled. And they walked away from their religious institutions. And they were discussing at work one day their experience of common loss. And so they decided to go out to lunch together and talk about their experience. And they found that at the end of lunch, they felt better. And so they had an idea that they would put out on social media, invite other friends. And the next weekend, they had 8 friends over, all who had experienced loss as a young person and never had it reconciled. And so they came together over dinner and a bottle of wine, and they shared their stories of loss. And in their short sharing of their stories, they began to feel healing in that midst. What am I describing? Now, this is a room of Catholic leaders. You know what I'm describing, right? The early church, Eucharist. They have reconstructed Eucharist, small e, locally and organically. They've reconstructed a religious experience. Now the dinner party is in every major city across the US. Thousands of young adults in their 20s and 30s come together once a month at dinner tables around the country for that same experience. Fascinating. Here's the second religious community. Anyone familiar with this one? Anyone in the room a CrossFitter? In a box? So CrossFit, if you think that CrossFit is not a quasi-religious experience, you don't yet understand CrossFit. So let me tell you this. I've been following the founder of CrossFit for a long time now. And last week I came across a training video that he was doing, and it finally went, boom, that's what's happening. Trying to figure out, why is CrossFit the largest conglomeration of small communities around the world now, larger than the church itself? A multi-billion-dollar industry that is all about local community, neighborhood-based community. So Greg, the founder of CrossFit, was training a room of coaches, fitness coaches, who work at CrossFit boxes. And he said this to them. He said, do you want to succeed as a coach? Yes, we want to succeed. He said, then you need to understand this. We are not in the fitness business. Do I want you to teach proper technique and help people get fit? Yes, but we are not in the fitness business. We are in the belonging business. And there's only one way for you to get clients and retain clients and grow your client base, and that's this. When they leave you after an hour, if they do not believe that you know their deepest sorrows, their deepest sufferings, their deepest joys, their deepest longings, they will not stay with you. But if you come to know them in that way, they will never leave you. That is what CrossFit is founded on. The belonging business. And why are people in droves coming to CrossFit? To get fit? A little bit. To belong? A lot of it. The local yoga meditation, a space of quiet in a very noisy, chaotic world. Or you may have heard of Nuns and Nuns, if you're familiar with that. Another organic small community of religious women and unaffiliated religious millennials who are seeking the spiritual impulses in their life, coming together in community for conversation and social engagement. Fascinating. So what we see is this shift in culture. We have a church that is built around a particular paradigm that looks like this. That believing leads to behaving, leads to belonging, and we call that orthodoxy. But what we see in all of these examples that we just looked at is that is no longer what draws people and holds people in a community. In fact, it's just the opposite. That belonging is the foundational point of a person's religious identity. Seeking a place where I belong, and if I do not believe that I belong here, I will leave here and find a place where I do. So the paradigm, the religious longing in people's lives is built around a paradigm that the church has just the opposite approach to. Very interesting. but not what you as Catholic school leaders understand. So Patrick Manning says this. So what can we do? Well, as it turns out, the answer is found in cows. Surprised us too, but it's true. So this is research this is legitimate research. Somebody actually paid for this to be done. This is research out of the UK. And they were doing research on why some dairy cows produce more milk than other dairy cows. And this is what they found. So I'm going to show you 3 responses, and you tell me which of these factors is the factor that produces an extra, 68 gallons of milk in a cow per year. You ready for this test? Is it organic high-yield alfalfa? Is it naming and calling the cow by name? Or is it supplemental concentrate mixtures with the right amount of minerals and vitamins? So who would say A? Who would say B? You see, this is exactly why I can't be a school teacher, right? I do not know how to design a test. Total failure. You are totally right. So it happens to turn out that in fact, cows that have been given a name and are called by name produce more milk than cows that don't. And if you want to look at the source of this research, there's the data. You can go check it out. Well, as it turns out, as we sort through all of this data and these stories and listening to the sacred longings of young people, what's true for cows happens to be true for us as humans as well. Now, it turns out, just in case you're curious, there are classic cow names and cute cow names. And there's even a website you can go to generate your own cow name if you want to do that. Quite a revelation, I suppose so. But in the same way, it is an important revelation for us. What's true for cows happens to be exactly true for us. That there is, for all of us, this deep human longing. And if we could summarize for you what we heard in the young people say, that their deepest longing from the church, from their community, what that longing is, it would sound like this.
I want to be known.
In a place where my true self is nurtured.
In a place where I am welcome.
A place where it's free of judgment. A place where I don't fear rejection. Where I'm free to express my struggles, my doubts, and my hopes.
A place where I'd be missed if I were gone.
The single biggest takeaway for us as Catholic educators from all of this data is that people do not leave places where they believe they are known. Where they are known by name, known in such a way that they are utterly convinced they would be missed if they were gone. I am convinced that the Catholic school system in the US will soon be one of the last touch points we have in the lives of young people for the Catholic Church. We see the trend lines in the US following very much the trend lines of Western Europe and Australia, where parish life is fading away. And yet the Catholic school system is critical that we maintain as a community where this kind of sense of belonging can be experienced. There is nothing more significant, more impactful that you can do as Catholic educators than to build a community where young people believe they are known, where they are seen by you, where you see every sorrow and suffering. The founder of CrossFit, we are in the belonging business. If you read the opening paragraph of the Constitution on the Church in the Modern World from Vatican II, it begins this way. The joys and the hopes, the sorrows and the sufferings of the people of this world, they are the joys and the hopes and the sorrows and the sufferings of the followers of Christ. The church exists for one purpose: to carry forward the work of Christ so that the world may be fashioned anew according to God's design. CrossFit is carrying out the call of Lumen Gentium. And you have an incredible opportunity. I can't tell you that if we create this kind of sense of belonging in young people's life, that it's going to change the rate of disaffiliation in America, because there is a force much bigger at play, and that likely won't change that. But it can do this. It can impact a young person's life to be known in such a way that they leave your institution and they know without a doubt that there is a God who loves them, that they are lovable, and they are capable of loving others. And even if they leave this institutional expression, they will go into the world and reconstruct new ways of expressing that gospel reality in the world. And that is exactly what we see happening. And it is because of the gift of people like you who have given your life to care for, to pay attention, and to love these young people in that moment that you have them, that moment God has entrusted them to your care. And that is the greatest gift we can give in our Catholic education. And so I thank you for that work, and I thank you for your time in being here this afternoon. Quick commercial, because you can't pass that up. If you're not familiar with the Going